It's a great pleasure to be here at the Turkish Culture Foundation with Nurhan, and I hope that I live up to her presentation, her introduction. So the reason for talking about this gun is, as you can see perhaps from the slide that's up already, it's very glamorous indeed. And what's happened is that the gun was bought in the late 19th century by Henry Walters, who gave his collection to the city of Baltimore, and it's now the Walters Art Museum. But this gun was part of the collection from that point. No one has done any work on it, and I wasn't aware of its existence until Amy Landau went to be the curator for the Islamic collections at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. And Amy is currently planning an exhibition that will now take place in 2015, and it will be seen in Baltimore and San Francisco and Doha in Qatar. And the idea of the exhibition is that individual objects from the Islamic world have stories to tell. Very often we treat Islamic art as a sort of generic, ahistoric set of objects. There's a tendency, especially from the past, to do that. And Amy's aim is that we should look at a series of objects as the products of particular points in history. And this seemed to be the Ottoman object that was already in their own collection that could form the focus of one of these displays. They're called vignettes, which is a term that's becoming quite popular in museum and exhibition displays. And the idea is that we show one object, and that around it there will be other objects which relate to it. And she invited me to write about this gun. My publications in the world of gun history are zero. So I think it was a general hope that I'd be able to pull something out of the hat. But what I did was I asked another friend of Nurhan's, Dr. Bora Keskiner, to be my co-author. So I want to make clear at the beginning that this lecture comes out of ideas of Amy Landau's, but that also what I'm going to tell you is comes out of me discussing things with Bora, and I hope to have time to deal with a poem of Sayyid Vehbi, who was the court poet under Sultan Mahmud III, which is definitely part of Bora's contribution, because he's the one who went through the diwans of the period to find poems that related to guns. And actually, he found two poems by Sayyid Vehbi. I'm going to discuss one of them. And they tell you an incredible amount about the culture that produced this magnificent object. But in this lecture, I'm going to try and cover three things. One of them is actually to show you the gun, which is so extraordinary, to me anyway, that I think it is worth having a slow look at it, because there are so many different things in it, and it does unexpected things apart from fire bullets. Well, actually, of course, I shouldn't say that. This is where my integration into the world of gun history is, of course, that you don't fire bullets from a musket, which is that you fire balls, which are round, not bullet-shaped. And also I want to, obviously what I wanted to do was to set it into the history of guns in the Ottoman Empire. That's the second part of it. And the third part is to look at one of the poems by Sayyid Vehbi illustrating the gun culture that existed at the Ottoman court in the early 18th century, which I have to say is, almost all of this has come as a complete surprise to me, and it's been a great adventure. And I'm lucky I've had the time over the summer to do this work. So here is the gun. I ought to be able to tell you how long it is, but I actually forgot to bring that piece of information with me, so I hope you'll forgive me. But it is the normal length of an Ottoman musket of the period. And in fact, I can tell you, I'll show you a document that tells you that in general the barrels are 5 spans long, which is 110 centimetres. And I think that's true from this. So we're talking about something which is about 1.4 metres long. It's very long. And one of the things that it's been in conservation at the Walters Art Museum, and one of the things that the conservators were very concerned about was, concluded, was that the gun cannot have been used. It was a display piece. And that's because it's covered, you can see that it's covered in gems. And I presume that what they mean is that if you fired it, some of the gems would fall off. But of course, if you're aware of what they did to gemstones at the Ottoman court, they had so many of them, and actually one of the things was not necessarily just to display things with them, but to use them. And if you lost some, that was okay. You just stuck some more on. So I think, and what I did in England, if you pick up a gun, that's what you do to guns. You know, you pick them up. In America, if you pick up a gun, people presume you're going to use it, and they get very, very afraid. So the first thing I did when I got the gun was to pick it up. So you have the double thing of Americans, it's like normal Pacific Americans at the time who work in conservation laboratories, not liking that at all. Partly both for social reasons, but also, of course, because it's an object and they like to use objects as little as possible in order to protect them. But I think it was the right thing to do, because what it showed me was that the balance of the gun was extremely good. It was a fantastic weapon to hold, because it felt like something that that was of the best quality in terms of the fact its balance and the way that what do you call it? I can't remember the word. Using the nishan. Targeting, aiming. That's it. Sorry. So I think that's something which I don't use a gun very often, but I do go shooting sometimes, and it was exactly like the sort of gun that the weight of it was very much like the sort of gun you're given in England to shoot with.
How heavy is it?
Well, I'm sorry, but I haven't got that information. Yeah, but it is. I mean, it's the weight of a normal.
Normal?
Yeah. I mean, it is not particularly heavy.
I see.
Yeah. And because, of course, it is quite heavy, but the balance is correct, so that when you lift it, the weight is evenly distributed, so that you can lift it properly. So that was my experience with the gun itself, and it's very, as you can see, it's very heavily decorated, so that even the muzzle has this gold inlay around it. And I have to say that there's a lot of ambiguity about what you can call the inlay on guns or anything else in English. And in fact, the traditional term for the gold was damascening, so I think that's the one I'm going to use this time at the moment. So you've got a sort of a damascening around the muzzle, which in the Ottoman text that I'm going to look at later is actually called zerkuft. So that seems to be zerkuft decoration. And you can see from this that from the end of the ramrod is also decorated. So almost everything on this gun is decorated. But it's decorated in lots of different ways. You can also see from this end of the gun the amazing patterning on the metal. And you can see the lines in the metal which seem to reflect the way that gun barrels were made in the Middle East. Which is that you took an iron core and you wrapped the iron or steel around it. So you took a bar and then you wrapped it around it, and then you filed away the iron core, so you were left with a barrel-shaped object. Of course, this one is hexagonal, so that seems to reflect that manufacturing process with this sort of slightly what would overall be a sort of helical motion by the metal. And you can see here that the notch in which the ramrod has been inserted is decorated already with this Baroque decoration set with what we'll call emeralds, green stones. But you can also see here the beginning of a cladding that covers the entire wooden part of the gun. In other words, the gun consists of the metal barrel set in a wooden stock with a metal flintlock to fire it off, but the barrel can be seen. It is heavily decorated in gold, but the wooden stock is entirely covered by this metal sheeting, which has been beaten over a mould in order to give it a Rumi pattern, and it's been gilded. Here's another section of the gun. You can see that the bands that link this part, the full part of the stock, with the barrel are these, which are decorated on the sides and bottom with settings of emeralds and rubies. But at the top, obviously, in order not to get in the way of aiming the gun, then you've got these flattened plates on the top of these. And these are generally called capucines in English. In the Turkish text, the word that seems to be used for these is bormak.
Bolbak.
Bormak, yumuşak yer. And you can see here, this is the sort of middle part of the gun, and you can see there is this damascening there too. Now, as you get to the back of the barrel, you get heavier and heavier damascening, and on this it's got the date here of 1145, which is equivalent to 1732 to 3, and on the other side you've got what I think is a sort of somewhat ethnographic part of the decoration, which is the term mashallah. And here, and this is the top side of the 6 sides. Here you can see that there's the maker's mark has been impressed, and then someone has dumped a load of gold over it. And you can see the word Amel, but I haven't yet been able to read the name of the gunsmith, of the barrel maker. And here we come to, this is the breech of the barrel, which is what you call the back end. And you can see that here's the lock, and that as the barrel ends, there's a special casing for it, which covers the adjacent part of the stock. And this is the lock. Now, part of the puzzle of this gun is that it was how on earth did it get to France, which is where Henry Walters bought it. Maybe it was given as a gift at some point, but when it was in the hands of the dealers in the late 19th century, they didn't treat it as a museum piece. They treated it as something which they restored and put in a fantastic case, along with all the other trappings that you'd need with a gun, but they weren't Ottoman, they were contemporary, they were European pieces. And then they presented it as something you sold to somebody who was a collector of guns, or who might, who would have it with other guns that they actually used. And part of that reconditioning, in the case of the gun itself, was the addition of this lock. So we can tell from the decoration and the type of lock it is that it is actually from the mid-19th century, and that it was made in the Caucasus, because there are quite a few guns in public collections and private collections, including some in the V&A, that we know that a lock of this type is from the Caucasus. So you say that's a very vague term. No one actually seems to know where it is, but there is a place in the Caucasus called Kubachi that actually specialised in inlaying gold into weapons, and so it may well be a product of the metalworkers of Kubachi, and which is currently it's in Dagestan, so it's on what's now the Russian side of the Caucasus. And on the bottom of this gun, there is actually of the lock, there is an inscription which says it's Ameli Mehmet, or in this case Ameli Muhammad, I suppose is more appropriate. It tells us that Sahibuhu Ahmed Khan, its owner it was made for Ahmed Khan, and then it gives a date, but the date has been scratched out except for the final 8. And we think that's actually a date from the middle of the 19th century, and that when they were adding the lock to the gun, they decided to get rid of this date so they could pretend that the lock was contemporary with the gun itself. For a moment, Bor and I got quite excited because we thought this might be Ahmed Khan, as in Sultan Ahmed III, and that what Mahmud I was doing was he had reconditioned in a very grand way an heirloom gun from the reign of Ahmed III. But I'm afraid that if this is the only evidence for it, then it succumbs to the historical truth, as it were. And we have to reject this as a possible piece of evidence. So we've got a gun which has got a mid-19th century flintlock, but this type of flintlock, as I'll be talking about later, is characteristic of Ottoman arms, and it's something which is shared, the type is shared between the Ottoman Empire and the Spanish Empire. And that's one of the puzzles that I had to face when I came to write about the gun and its historical context. You can also see that this type of mechanism sort of relates to what we know about how to fire a gun, because by this point, since the 16th century, there have been trigger mechanisms. So this is the trigger that fired the cock that then used to have a piece of flint stuck here. And as you can see, like everything else on the gun, the little plate, the little scutcheon round the trigger hole is decorated with, and in this case, with rubies. So here we're looking down. So here's the flintlock, and this is the end of the barrel here. And this is the, as I pointed out before, there's a piece of stock that's at the end of the barrel, the breech of the barrel, is in this special metal casing, which is covered with, in this case, and this is a grade above the normal decoration of the gun. It's got diamonds as well as rubies and emeralds. And here we have this is the back of this breech area of the stock, and we have here two little implements, all jewelled, which have their own little holes within the stock. And this, I've read in the accounts of the purchase that this big emerald and its casing, its mount, actually comes out, and there's a hidden compartment behind that. But I didn't actually check that out when I was in Baltimore, and I'll have to ask them to look into that to me. So here is the main part of the stock below. Now those two implements, I've taken this out of a much bigger photograph, so it's a little bit out of focus. But you can see that one is a little spoon, which was the measure in which you put the priming powder into the, perhaps I should point out. So there are two elements to the moving parts of the lock. There's this one, which was the cock, which had the flintlock in its jaws, and then there's the steel, which the flint struck, and this is the pan cover, and here is the pan, and there is the touch hole. So what happens is the flint strikes the steel, produces sparks which fall into the pan, and then the flash goes through that little hole and sets off the gunpowder inside the gun. So that is the little spoon with which you measure the priming powder and put it into the flash pan when you're preparing the gun. And on this side is the little sort of spike for unblocking any blockages that occur in the gun mechanism. So here we have the other side of the gun, and you can see that the two screws that hold the lock onto the gun, their screw heads have got their own little decorated headings, and there's the trigger again. And this is the main part of the stock of the gun that you actually hold. And you can see that it's decorated very lavishly with pieces of jade, which seem to be recycled from objects that probably had existed at earlier times. I mean, I would think that these are probably cut originally in the 16th century. And both the jade and the surroundings are covered lavishly in emeralds and rubies, which we can use in parentheses, because the rubies are maybe garnets, the emeralds may be other type rock crystal that's stained green, for example, all sorts of things. But the Ottoman court clearly had very large supplies of these precious stones, and therefore and they're usually foiled to make them. See in that case you can see a large emerald, but you can see something flashing back at you, which is the gold foil, which is placed underneath the gem to make it more shiny. And you can also see a great deal of this moulded metal that's used to plate the whole of the stock. Here's the other side. So this is that you see the top of the stock is a long piece of mutton fat jade with diamonds in settings along it, and it's bordered on either side by lots of emeralds. And on the bottom side of the stock actually had these jewel-like, it's like a piece of jewellery, which is plates entirely covered. They're made of the sort of gold openwork, but they're entirely covered with diamonds. And you can see perhaps that something unusual is about to happen, because the end of the stock, the butt of the stock, actually has a door on it, and it's decorated in the same way as this part of the stock on the outside, but on the inside it has this curious openwork brass plate, which you can lower to show the Tura of Sultan Mahmud I. So, I mean, I hope you showed with me the astonishment I suffered when I first saw that. It's just extraordinary. Why on earth would you want to put a Tura in diamonds on the inside of the butt of a gun, of a musket? And helpfully underneath it, the person has also put the date again, 1145, 1732 to 3. Now, if we go back to this, I think, you know, this is a little bit of very precise engraving. I mean, I find the brass work here almost more interesting than all the diamonds. And I was really worried about this, because this brass work looks very much like the sort of work you get in Europe after people have access to books like Owen Jones's Grammar of Ornament. That it seems to be a sort of a revival of Rumi or Arabesque designs, rather than something that I would count as contemporary to 1732. But I think that the way that I explain this to myself, because there's another piece which I should show you now. Maybe I'll take you through the next stages, which is when you look into the butt of the rifle, you have these extraordinary. They're like two very large brooches, which are entirely covered with diamonds, and they have this. There's this little screw here, which has a ruby at its tip, and then this little arm moves around to stop the diamond brooch thing, like the diamond brooch-like door, from opening. So you've got one for each. And when you, yeah, and when you open it,
oh my God,
you've got two holes. This is where I was talking. Here's another brass plate with this very precise, to me, 19th century looking arabesque pattern. And I was trying to justify it. And I think actually that this is a key thing to looking at this gun. That, for example, when you look at the brass plate that covers all the wooden surfaces, I say brass, we don't actually know what sort of base metal it's made of, but it's probably a copper alloy plate that has been hammered over a mould to produce this pattern and then gilded. Well, that pattern too does not look like it comes from 1732. And then I realised that probably the moulds that they used were much older. There is you can trace this in other types of artistic production in Istanbul. And for example, Zerrin Tanında did a lot of work on the binders who worked in Istanbul in the 16th and 17th century. And she was able to trace the families over several generations. And because of this continuity of workshop practice, it was quite the most expensive part of tooling up to make an Ottoman binding of the 16th century was to make the moulds from leather that you use to make the pressure moulded recessed parts of the bindings. And you can see in 18th century bindings that they're still using the same pressure moulds that they made in the 16th century. And you can see that because they've become very worn. In other words, high status bindings don't have them in them, but if you've got jobbing bindings that are made for, middle rank manuscripts, then they have what looks like a classy Ottoman binding, except the reading of the motifs in the ornament is very poor. And so you can see that they did keep moulds for very long times, and therefore the plating of the wooden parts of the gun is done with a design that's not contemporary, that may be more than 100 years earlier in its origination. And so we've got one part of the gun in which I don't feel at all worried about the anachronistic nature of the decoration. And so then I'm faced with these. And I think about these is that I think maybe that we just have to think of the gun as being the work of lots of different people. And the sort of precision you see in these two brass pieces inside the butt may be due to the fact that they were made by clockmakers, the people who were used to making, of which there were a lot in Beyoğlu, people who are used to making things very precisely. And so they have a much more mechanical way of producing things, which makes them look 19th century, but they're using patterns that were long established. So this is my current theory about this. And I've not actually discussed it with Boris, so I can say to you that bit is my theory. He may stamp on it. So anyway, when you've opened the back door of the butt of the gun, and you've opened the two diamond brooches, this is what comes out. This is what the holes are for.
And what is?
So one of them
This
is
is so surprising.
yes. One of them is a knife, and the other one is a pen box.
Unbelievable.
And those are decorated, as you can see, top quality decoration. The knife and the handle of the knife and the hilt of the knife, I should say, and the pen box are in a completely different world to the casing of the gun, for example. These, we almost find it difficult to believe they were already made in 1732, because they are so much part of the Baroque style that you think, certainly a little bit of it can be seen in Ahmed III's reign, but it really takes off in the latter part of Mahmud I's reign. And this may also be teaching us something about the way that elements of the European style were around in Istanbul before you get the big projects like the Nur Osmaniye Mosque. And there's really interesting thinking going on about how we must treat the Baroque elements in Ottoman art as not as European intrusions, but as just part of the artistic environment of Istanbul at this point. It was never a pure Turkish city. It was never a pure Islamic city. It was full of Europeans selling and making objects that were in the same style as they made in Geneva and Paris and London and Venice. So it's part of the atmosphere, the artistic atmosphere of the city, and it's not surprising that these elements are taken up. This is, in European terms, this is quite a long way into the Baroque. So here's the gun. Here's the knife, and you can see that the handle. When Nurhan first saw this, you thought it was Indian, didn't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
My reaction was Indian.
Yeah.
The first sight.
And I actually been quite. I think there's an interesting piece of work to be done on the shape of hilts of daggers, because this one would stand outside the general trend in any case. But I think maybe that someone was trying to create out of a normal Ottoman hilt shape something that matched this new aesthetic with its curved lines and sort of tendency to ballooning shapes. So it is clearly en suite with the rest of the gun, to the extent that it's got the same moulded pattern on the hilt, as well as the heaps of gemstones set in the setting. And very helpfully, on either side, when we first saw this, both Bora and I mean, this is another thing, coming to terms with it is really difficult. We thought that this could not be the original blade. It doesn't look like early 18th century work to us. It looked like 19th century work. And we're working on the poem, which is quite badly written, which again didn't seem to match with the extraordinary accomplishment of the gun as a whole. It's a poem talking. There's the word hançer, for example.
Is it in Ottoman? Or
yeah, it's in Ottoman, so it must be Turkish. But actually, just here is the date 1145. So, and also, the decoration actually extends over the blade.
Yeah.
So it's going to be very difficult
to use it.
Well,
yes.
probably.
I don't think they're worrying about if you really had to use it. And I suppose when you go hunting, you do need sometimes you need a blade to finish off the animal that you've wounded and things like that.
Is it pretty sharp?
I haven't tried to see.
I mean, if you had
there's absolutely no problem with it being a proper knife. No. This is much longer than I thought. So here we have, we've closed the doors again, and here we have all the things, because inside the pen case is a pen holder and a pen knife. There's no makta, is interesting, but it doesn't look as though there's room for it. But it's you can. I've never seen a pen holder quite as luxurious as that, and of course most people don't even bother with them. Yeah. So the documentation we have on the gun is that the barrel is signed and dated 1145. The door of the butt is dated 1145, and the little knife is decorated 1145. So what we've been, perhaps I shouldn't open that. A bit confusing. So it seems at the moment we're working on the basis that this gun really was made at the command of Sultan Mahmud I in 1145, 1732 to 3. And it does actually seem to fit into the historical setting of that time. But first of all, I'd like just to talk to you a bit about the Ottomans and how the Ottomans came to have guns. Because, and this is where let's go back to the 15th century. For most of their history, the development of Ottoman handheld guns ran in parallel to that of the development of cannons. But it's due to the nature of the sources that most of the attention has gone on to Ottoman cannon. And most recently in the book by Gabor Orgeston, which is on Guns for the Sultan, which was published in 2005, which is a very thorough treatment of the history of Ottoman cannons. So Ottomans started to use they started to use cannons in the second half of the 14th century, as far as we can tell. And by the second half of the 15th century, some of the bronze cannon they cast were very large indeed, as you can see from surviving examples. Now you have quite a lot of these large cannons in Istanbul, but I thought I'd show you one that I was rather surprised to find was in Fort Nelson, Portsmouth, England, and it's dated 1464, it's cast by Munir Ali. This one I do know the length of, it's 5.18 metres, and it's got a calibre of 63 centimetres and a weight of 16.8 tonnes. And you can see that in Fort Nelson they display it in the two hearts which can be screwed together. But the reason that this was actually used against British ships in 1805 in one of the forts in the Dardanelles, and then later on in the century Sultan Abdulaziz gave it to Queen Victoria, which is how it ended up in Portsmouth. And of course Portsmouth isn't a place that people generally go to, including me. So I've never actually gone to see it, but I think I must. And it's my thanks to Wikipedia for this excellent photograph. Anyway,
is it in the storage?
No, this is the display. In the Fort Nelson is a museum. You can see the label telling you all about it.
I see.
Yeah. So these huge pieces misled later historians who presumed that giant cannons were characteristic of Ottoman artillery in the succeeding centuries. And one of Gabor Orgeston's achievements is to show that the Ottomans made ordnance in a wide variety of sizes. Now the reason for going on about cannon a bit is to show you this picture, because in the collection of Walter's Art Museum there's also a manuscript of Atai's Hamse, which includes battle scenes as well as other scenes we won't talk about at the moment. And this one, you can see that this is the Frankish line. These are presumably the Habsburg forces. And on the other side, where's my pointer? On the other side, you've got the Ottoman forces with the gunners, but behind them, you've got a musketmen, I should say. You've got a variety of small cannon. You've got what look like mortars and these small cannon, And these are much more characteristic of the type of cannons that were produced by the Ottomans up to, say, the 18th century, into the 19th century. So I just thought it was great to show that the Walters Art Gallery also has this, this amazing series of miniature paintings. Later on, it was the manuscript is from the early in the century, and it has one painting that relates to the style of Levy, but the other paintings seem to have been added much later on in the century. So we can think, actually, one of the things about the cannon is they look characteristically Ottoman because in the painting they're green, and that suggests that they're covered in verdigris because they're cast from bronze. And one thing that the Ottomans carried on doing after, long after Europeans had started to use iron, was that they cast their larger medium caliber guns in bronze. And Argostons explained that by the tactical advantage it gave them, because the cannon made from bronze were heavier, were lighter and more safe than the iron ones. In other words, that they didn't blow up by mistake in the faces of their gunners as often as the iron ones, and they were lighter than the iron ones, which made them obviously easier to move about. And the Ottomans had to import the tin that they used for casting the bronze, but they had a large access to copper ore, which meant that they had one of the basic ingredients in ample supply. But Argoston's arguments on this issue fit into a wider case he makes. Although there are some areas in which the Ottomans appear deficient, such as their apparent lack of interest in standardizing the caliber of their guns, they were generally successful at maintaining parity in firearms technology with their enemies. It's been normal for military historians to attribute to the Ottomans a conservatism in the face of innovation, which these writers considered characteristic of all Muslims, and to presume that the empire suffered from technological inferiority and had a lack of production capacity, which led to dependence on European imports. That's what you read in all the 19th and earlier 20th century accounts of Ottoman cannon making. But what Argoston shows is that none of that is true. As a result, the Ottomans were able to maintain their firepower and logistical superiority against the Austrian Habsburgs and the Venetians, at least to the end of the 17th century. And indeed, the Ottoman state could not have created an empire with such vast territories and then controlled them over such a long period if it had not been vigilant in observing advances made by others and flexible in developing its own technical and logistical solutions to the challenges it faced. So, why am I saying all this about cannons? Because the history of cannons is quite well explored by Argoston. It shows that all the sorts of things that people used to say about the Ottoman armaments and where they got their ideas from and where they got their cannons from was completely untrue. I mean, it was a misrepresentation, which the study of the archive sources over the last few years has shown. And this is the same for handguns, except the handguns have not been studied in any great way. So I can tell you that the Janissaries, who are were already using handheld guns by the first half of the 15th century. The text seems to suggest that they were being in use by the time of Murad II. And from this time, the proportion who were armed with guns rather than bows increased in stages over a long period. So it's in the reign of Sultan Murad III that we find the Venetians, the Venetian government being told by its sources in Istanbul that almost all the Janissaries were now equipped with arquebuses. So there's a long period from the early 15th century to the late 16th century when the number of handguns used by the army increases until it's almost all the Janissaries, all the infantry are actually using them.
During the time of slavery, it was well established.
Yeah. And but the mechanism where they were using at that point were matchlocks. So this is from the Vienna album, and it shows Murad III, and he's been accompanied by two retainers, two guards, who are brandishing extremely fine examples of arquebuses. And if I can read a bit more, what we've so you've got the long barrels, which are characteristic of early Ottoman guns, They're set, here we can see they're set in wooden stocks, which are actually painted in this case. And you can see the ramrods protruding from just below the barrel at the top. And let's look at the matchlock mechanism. It consists of a trigger. So here's the trigger. There's the trigger. And then there's the curved lever. And this is a little vise. We should be holding a lit piece of cord called the quick match in English, the fitil. And here's the pan with its little cover on it. So what happens is you pull the trigger, that operates this lever which comes forward. The soldiers lifted the pan off of the flash pan so that the little lit piece of cord goes into the flash pan and ignites the priming powder, and then that sets off a flash which goes through to the breech of the barrel where there's a musket ball and a measure of powder, and it explodes the powder and the gun shoots the ball. So that the cord used was probably impregnated with saltpeter to make it more flammable. In this case, though, you can see that the guard has the piece of. So when you cut the fitil, the little piece of cord, off of a longer length which you're carrying with you. But he is holding the whole length and he's lit one end of it. And I would say that is the older style of firing an arquebus that dates from before that you had this little mechanism in order. So you would manually lower the lit fuse into the powder to set it off. And he's still doing that. So I think this is one of those things that shows the practices. That immediate reaction of the European commentators is, these are the conservative Ottomans who are doing something old-fashioned because they won't adopt a modern method. But actually, when you think about it, it's much safer. These people are standing beside the Sultan. In order to be ready to fire their guns at someone who attempts anything on the Sultan, they'd have to be loaded and primed. But if you've got a lit match in here, it's much more likely that there'd be an accident and that you would fire the gun in error. And of course, if you fire the gun next to the Sultan, who knows what would happen? You might actually shoot the Sultan by mistake. And so, by holding the lit match in your other hand, you're making sure that you don't fire the gun in error. And so this is nothing to do with conservatism. This is just a practical approach by people who don't wish to shoot their own sovereign. Matchlock guns are not being used are still being used in the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century. So that type of lock was still going when the gun was made for Sultan Mahmud I. But during the 17th century, you get the new type, which is muskets with locks armed with a flint, which is this type. So what you have here, we looked at it before. You've got this cock which holds the flint in, and this is the head of a screw that you use to open the jaws of the cock. Then you put the flint in, and then you screw it up again to hold the flint tight. And then you've got the apparatus here, which is the steel and the cover of the flash pan. So what happens, of course, is when you pull the trigger, this releases a sear, which is a little catch, and the flint is pushed forward by the cock as it's released from the heavy spring that's operating it. It strikes the steel, and the sparks fall into the pan. We've discussed that before. So that's this new type of new type of lock that was invented some point in the middle of the 16th century and rapidly became very popular in Europe. And then early in the reign of Louis XIII in France, who came to the throne in 1610, and the sort of last stage in the development of the flintlock took place. And so when Europeans talk about a flintlock, they talk about that type of French lock, which became popular in Northern Europe. But before 1610, another type of flintlock had been invented, which had most of the advantages of the fully formed flintlock, which is that when, for example, when the cock was pushed forward by the spring after it had been released, and it hit this thing, which is the steel from which it makes the sparks, if you join that to the cover of the pan, what happens is that the steel is knocked back by the cock striking it, and in doing so, because it's joined to the cover of the pan, it opens the pan automatically so that the sparks fall in at the very last moment, so that the priming powder is kept safe from the elements, and to the very last moment that you want to use the dry powder to set the gun off. So that was a big improvement. But this sort of lock, because it is a flintlock, but it's not the flintlock. English writers on guns, probably since the 19th century, have been calling it the Michelet lock, which is a name associated with a certain sort of, well, no one really knows what it is, but they think it's that there were, during the Napoleonic War, there were Spanish troops called Micheletes, and they think that's where they got the name from. But if we, so we've got this type of lock, which is common to both the Spanish and the Ottomans, but no one has explained why. And for example, Luigi Ferdinando Marsigli, who wrote his military condition of the Ottoman Empire before he died in 1730, it was published in 1732, which is the same year as the gun of Mahmud first was made. He makes the observation. He says that altro moschetto col fucile più simile alla spagnola che dall'altra maniera, which is enough. He's showing this. This is the caption for this gun, which means another musket with a lock more similar to the Spanish than to any other type. So people knew this in the 1730s, but they don't explain it. So what I tried to do was to work out how it could have been transmitted. And one of the obvious things to say is that the Spanish were in constant contact with the Ottoman subject states in the Maghreb, with Algiers and Tunis and Libya. And so you can see that in fact, the invention of a new type of lock is often associated with Charles V's attempt to capture Algiers in 1541. And apparently the weather was so bad that it meant that the arquebuses didn't work. And so he thinks that there has to be an improvement on the arquebus, which then turns out to be, everyone says that was the flintlock. So there's this association of that contact. So that's the thing I first thought of. It must be that the Spanish and the people in the Levant, in the Maghreb, exchanged this technology at quite an early date. But actually, I then came across this text. Now you know that in 1640, Kemalkesh Mustafa Pasha was facing yet another phase of the great fiscal crisis that took place in the Ottoman Empire during the 17th century, well, from the time of Murad III onwards. And what happened was that in 1624, they'd issued a new acture that was, that had, I've changed place, get my statistics right. They had 120 acture to the ducat. So the ducat was 3.5 grams of gold, and 120 actures were necessary. That was the exchange rate they established. Because basically they raised the amount of silver in the acture in order to make it a more stable currency. And by 1640, the debasement of the coinage by the state had reached such a terrible state that there were 250 acture to the gold ducat. And this is causing all sorts of problems in the Ottoman economy. So Kemalkesh Mustafa Pasha decided to issue, the first issue of Ibrahim, the Sultan Ibrahim's reign, would be at the old rate of 120 actures to the gold ducat. And in order to do that, he had to make sure that all the prices on the Istanbul market were marked down to reflect the new value of the acture. I mean, the law suggests that it should be about half, but sometimes it says a third, so obviously it wasn't fixed. So you had a committee going around the markets deciding what the goods would be worth under the new acture. And this means that they recorded everything on the Istanbul market in 1640. And it's a very valuable document. It's been published twice, once by Kütükoğlu and once by Yaşar Yücel. And among the people that they talked to were the people who sold guns. And so they tell us quite a lot about the sorts of guns that were available on the Istanbul market in 1640. And I've put up there because, for those of you who can read the Ottoman text, but I'll read out what it actually says, which is the first line, beginning Bormakları, is gun with a barrel of Damascus steel, firing balls weighing 10 drams, which is, if you take Argoston's weights, 10 drams is 30 grams. It's 5 spans long, which as I said is 110 centimetres. The stock has silver sarma decoration, coral and silver needles. The barrel is blackened, that is the steel of the barrel is blackened. And the mudahil, which I take to be the Damascene decorations along the barrel, are in gold. The capucines are silver, and it has its stock, and it's for sale for 4,800 akçes under the new akçe worth 120 to the ducat. Number 2 is another gun with a barrel of Damascus steel, 5 spans long, and firing balls weighing 7 drams. The capucine silver with no stock, worth 700 akçes. The third one is a gun firing balls weighing 5 drams. It's got a rifle barrel 5 spans long. The mudahil decorations, that's the Damascening, the capucines and the sight are in silver. And it was made in a state workshop from old horseshoes with no stock. So you can imagine that horseshoes had suffered a lot of pounding during their life. And actually they made a very firm sort of iron from which to make guns. The fourth one is a gun with an iron barrel and no stock, firing balls weighing 5 drams, that's about 15 grams. It's 5 span longs and it has silver capucines. So all of those, they are matchlock guns because it doesn't say anything at all about the lock. Because in the sixth one it says gun, iron barrel made by a master gunsmith, firing balls weighing 5 drams, with a flintlock of Hungarian manufacture, with no stock, 440 akçe. 6 is a gun, the barrel of Damascus steel, 5 spans long, with a Hungarian-style flintlock, firing balls weighing 6 drams, the mudahil decorations in gold and silver, the muzzle with the kuf decoration with no stock, and that's 2,240 aspers. And then we move on, you see tabanca. Now, when I started this project, I thought that tabanca meant pistol. But it's absolutely clear from the context in which it's used that at this stage the word tabanca meant flintlock. And in fact, the original sense of tabanca is a slap in the face. That. And so you can imagine the hard slap in the face is the equivalent of the flint striking the steel. So it makes etymological sense. And it makes sense because in the way that it's used in this document and in the poem by Said Vehbi, it's very clear that tabanca means flintlock. And that therefore opens up a big problem. So as when you see the word tabanca and you think it means pistol, now you have to think, does it mean pistol or flintlock? So I can't find this recorded in any dictionary. I don't know whether it's an actual discovery. But here it says tabanca sanatında mahir macari namerdi işi ve anamanen düstar işi olursa 140 akçe. So this is the only thing it says about flintlocks. When they're work of unmanly Hungarians who are skilled at making them, or of local masters that resemble these, they are worth 140 akçe. So then it talks about the stocks, the kundak. So it says sarma kundan gayet alası. So then it's got the same sarma kundak, which sarma seems to be some sort of wood. There is actually a definition in a work by Robert Elwood, but I've not been able to find any other. It's some sort of, he says it's when you wrap a cord around the wood of the stock and set fire to it to create banding. But actually, the third one is sarma yollu edna kundak, which is a stock of sarma of low quality, which has got stripes on it. So if this text needs to define the striped sarma and differentiate it from ordinary sarma, then I'm not sure that his definition is right. But then we go down to, we've got a stock made of walnut wood, we've got a stock made of maple, and then we've got a stock made of maple. That means a stock of maple made for a flintlock gun. And then we have a small gun, the stock of a small gun with a flintlock. is 60 akçe, and then the last one is stock of hornbeam wood for an ordinary gun, harci tüfek. And I think that's telling us, again, that harci tüfek is referring to flintlocks, to matchlocks, because what we've had is we've had all of the stocks are for matchlocks, then we have 2 for flintlocks, and then it goes back to matchlocks, so it says an ordinary gun. So what this document tells us is that in 1640, the people on the Istanbul market thought that the flintlock, and I'm presuming that it is this Mikale lock, came from Hungary. So I think that what that's telling us is that the flintlock was transmitted to the Ottomans during the Long War of 1533 to 1606. So that is a war in which the Ottomans were fighting the Habsburgs, but it's before the development of that last phase, what's called the true flintlock was emerged in Europe. So the Hungarian troops, I mean the Habsburg troops, shouldn't call them really Hungarians, were fighting with flintlocks, but they were, I'm saying, they must have been of the Mikale type, because they hadn't yet been upgraded to that last type. So I think that's the historical moment at which the Ottomans got it. And the reason for alighting on the Long War of 1593 to 1606 is from actually something that Argoston taught me when I was reading his book, which is that in the run-up to the... So you've got a space in the second half of the 16th century when the Ottomans were not fighting the Habsburgs. And during that time, the Habsburgs were thinking about how they were going to defend themselves from the Ottomans the next time that the war broke out. And it is, they decided that one of the things they were superior in was the use of infantrymen with handguns. So they upped the number of handguns that were available on the Hungarian and Croatian front. And so when war broke out in 1593, it's a war that no one wanted, but it broke out anyway, they are actually quite successful by using their infantry troops massed with handguns. And the Ottomans, at that point, learned very quickly that in order to cope with the Habsburgs, they would have to increase the number of troops with handgun enormously. So they increased the number of the Janissaries, who are all armed with handguns, and it's at that point that they start to recruit the Sekban militias, who are ordinary rank and file members of the Ottoman population. They give them guns and they teach them how to use them. And of course this is the very beginning of all the problems that you get with the Jalali revolts, because if you give your subjects guns, they'll use them against you once you've taught them. But, so that is I think that it's in that, the sudden rise in the issue over handgun use in war, that the Ottomans learned to use flintlocks because they're better than matchlocks in many ways, and that explains why the type of flintlock used by the Ottomans is the one that predates the invention of the French flintlock in the 1610s. So here is the poem that Borrow found, which I've been trying to translate. And it's a poem recording Sultan III's prowess as a marksman. It was composed by the court poet Said Vehbi, who died in 1736, and was designed to be inscribed on a stele set up to record the Sultan's achievement. The text is taken from the Divan of Said Vehbi in Topkapi. And you can see that it's the technical person here was very worried by my underlinings of some spaces. But that, of course, is to show where there's a liaison between the vowel at the end of one word and the consonant at the end of one verb and the vowel at the beginning of the next word, which affects the meter. Because when the first thing I do with the poem is try to work out how it fits the meter. Anyway, so don't pay attention to that. So you can see it says, O Sultani Süleyman Bar Gehiman Indi Hurşid. Biniş takribiyle geç ederken deşki hamunu, müşerref eyle günlerde bir gün bu ferih cayı, nişana kurşun atmak istedi tabi humayunu. So it says, that sultan whose court is equal to Solomon's, who resembles the sun, while passing through the untamed wilderness as though riding in state, graced this joyful location with his presence one day. His august nature wished to fire balls at a target. So, you know, you're already, it seems a very hands-on sort of poem compared to the things about Sufi love that we all read when we're doing Osman courses at university. Or you did in my case. So, he made a then the next line is Firengi bir zera macetti 85 adım yerden Tüfengi zer nişanla bu mahalden attı kurşunu. He made a Frankish ducat his aim from a distance of 85 paces. From this very spot he fired a ball from his gun damascened with gold. So the shot rang out. Tabanca çaktı. So if you've got a tüfeng and then you fire it, what makes the crack sound is the tabanca. So that's why I'm saying here too, it makes sense that tabanca means flintlock. Bozdu çihreyi tasviri çasarı, gözlemez yerdeyken didesinden vurdu melunu. The shot rang out. The face on the emperor's portrait was smashed. While it was in a place which the eye could not reach, in other words, it's too far away to see, he had struck the cursed man through his eye. And I just thought it would be interesting to find out what sort of coin he was firing at. And so I was looking for coins that slightly predate or date from the period of Ahmed III. And so you can see that here's Leopold I with his terrible Habsburg chin, which is incredibly boldly signalled on the coin. But that's silver. I did manage to find another coin of Leopold I that shows, which is a gold one. So you can see that there of course is the eye through which Ahmed III is supposed to have fired the bullet. And then here's another one, and just for the sake of it, here's another gold coin. This is of Joseph I, who was actually ruling at the same time as Ahmed III. So I just thought it was interesting to look at the things that the Sultan was actually supposed to be firing at. So, Acep kundak bıraktı hane-i samani adaya, bu fali hayrelitti kurşuna sağ düşmeni dunu. Did he leave a bundle of rags in the house of the place where his enemies stored their equipment, I wonder? This good omen caused the base enemy to melt like lead. So here the poet is moving on to make references of a poetic nature to what was going on, because kundak means both the stock of a barrel, but it also means the bundle of rags that you set light to and then threw into somebody's thatched roof in order to destroy their house during a war. And of course he says he's causing the base enemy to melt like lead because the word for ball in Turkish, in this case, is kurşun, which means lead. So there's sort of, he's doing this punning thing, which he also does in the other poem about Damat İbrahim Paşa. So, her adım başına bir kale almaya nişandır bu. Nice sahil olur, seyreyle kevni sırrı meknunu. So, this was a sign that at every step he would take a fortress. How will it be made manifest? Watch out for the coming into being of the hidden secret. And this reference to the Sirri Meknun, we are a little bit puzzled by at the moment, but we think it may be a reference to the fact that this is a title used for histories. So basically, it's saying, how will it be made manifest? Well, read about the Ahmed III's achievements in the chronicle of his reign. Tüfek alıp atarken panihade olduğu yerde nişangaha mukabil diktiler bu sengi mevzunu. So here we get to what they were doing. At this very spot where he stood while aiming his gun and firing, they erected this elegant stone facing the target. Tüfek atmakla kazdı sikeyi, mermerde taş dikti. Hatadan saklasın hak, padişahi rubi meskûnu. By firing a gun, he dug out the design in a coin. In marble, he erected a stone. May God preserve the Sultan from missing his shots. And of course, the Sultan is Padişahi Rubi Meskun, the emperor of the inhabited quarter of the earth. So, I think this poem sort of introduced me to a completely new world that I'd never imagined, which is that the Sultan Ahmed III went round displaying his skill as a marksman. And we are currently working on this because we think that Mahmud I is actually carrying on something that Ahmed III started. That under Ahmed III, as you can see from Keskin's work, things changed a lot, and that the Sultan formulated a new way of being the Sultan, and that actually marksmanship became part of that. And that's why in the first decade of Mahmud I's reign, he was very careful to maintain the traditions of Ahmed III. And it's only after 1739 where his triumph over the Austrians means he is his own man, and you can see the development of his own style in art and literature, that this period, the 1730s, is in fact an elongation of Ahmed III's reign. And I must say that there's another thesis which I've used a lot for this, which is that by Enver Rustem, which he did at Harvard, which is a very, very good examination of Ottoman culture in the 18th century, especially relating to the building of imperial mosques. And these ideas of Bora and Enver seem to be coming together to tell us something really quite deep about the early 18th century. And I think I'll end there. For one.